Welcome to Blue Pyramid Stories. Tonight we bring you another of our completely on the fly original stories. Original in manner of speaking because I lived them originally, and this is another relatively famous story from my own experience, famous among my friends, of course. And that is the adventure of how Scotland tried to kill me in many different ways, in many different parts. So let's get into it. I basically went to Scotland in 2000, the very end of 2000, start of 2001, over the new year, because I thought it would be great to ring in this fabulous new year in Scotland. But largely it was because the University of Glasgow was hosting a debate tournament, the World Championships for 2001, which was a very exciting opportunity to attend, or so I thought. And I was going to the debate tournament with my friend and coach at the time, Greg Wilson, who was a grad student at Brandeis, and we were very excited about our possibilities. And, you know, America had always sort of been shut out of Worlds. It was held in a British parliamentary style, which is very different than most of the American styles of debate, and it actually involves 4 teams in a room, so it's a very strange, different style. It's hard to adjust to. But we were optimistic and we were excited, and I took off, flew from Albuquerque when it was snowing, and when we landed in Iceland, it was still snowing, and my friend Russ and I tried to get our passports stamped in Iceland, and they glared at us and said, "Why do you want to do this? Why do you want to go through here?" And he said, "I don't know, we, want to get our passports stamped in Iceland, purpose of visit. See Iceland. Duration of visit, 5-10 minutes. They denied our request. And then we headed down to Scotland itself, and it was snowing in Glasgow also when we arrived, and that was a little bit unexpected. And it turned out that when we got there, it was the largest snowstorm in Glasgow history for at least the month of December, and maybe ever. The longest recorded snowstorm, highest duration, most volume. And this came at a time when we were being housed as the Americans. We were being housed in dorm rooms that they had turned off the heat for those dorm rooms. So it was already pretty cold outside, and then there was no way of getting heat inside because the dorm rooms weren't going to be used over winter break, and nobody had notified the University of Glasgow that these sort of remote dorm rooms that were a bus ride away from the actual tournament lodgings were going to be used to house world-class debaters. So it was a little chilly. Fast forward a couple days. Needless to say at this point, under the strain of debating in world style and throwing my voice out to be heard in a group of 4 debate teams and dealing with the general rigors of a long multi-day debate tournament and sleeping in about, 37 to 42 degree temperatures, I was losing my voice, which I was wont to do in the best of summery conditions at a debate tournament anyway. So I was miserably sick. I was losing my voice. I basically was, in the second day of competition, was being a mute to everyone else, wasn't talking to anyone, was saving my voice entirely for rounds, and I was chugging vitamin C packets like crazy. These things called Emergency that are sort of classic vitamin C aids to people's voice. So I'm chugging these things down, probably had 12 or 14 of them in a day or something. And I'm not really eating anything because I didn't really have an appetite and my throat hurt and it was hard to keep things down. So finally, the other problem with Scotland also that plays into this is that the food is just miserable in Scotland. And I'm a vegetarian, and so the food for vegetarians is especially miserable. The vegetarian haggis is really unappealing. And we have to deal with these ketchup beans that are just like sort of beans drowning in ketchup is one of the only things that they'll actually serve that's vegetarian, and just french fries. So I already was having a hard enough time finding food. And the tournament food is not particularly prone to vegetarians. It's not particularly good to begin with. So we come to dinner. We've had all our rounds for that day. My voice is hanging on by a thread. I have no energy. I look like death warmed over. And the vegetarian sandwich that they serve for dinner in these little brown bags is egg salad. Well, egg salad's primary ingredient is mayonnaise. And I, for life, for years before this, had sworn off mayonnaise. I hate mayonnaise. I hate the texture. I hate the flavor. I hate everything about mayonnaise. But mayonnaise is vegetarian, and so is the rest of egg salad sandwich. And I had not eaten in probably 12 hours by the time I was staring down this sandwich. And I looked at the sandwich. The sandwich looked at me, and I looked at the sandwich. I didn't like the look of it, and so I ate it. And I went into the last round of the day. And I thought, well, that wasn't so bad. I choked it down. It tasted really awful, but hey, I had a little more energy. And that was all well and good until the next morning, or a little earlier than I had planned to wake up the next morning, when I awaken and immediately feel a familiar pull. Not very familiar to me because I don't drink alcohol at all, but familiar enough from various bouts of the flu to run to the toilet as fast as humanly possible. And I kneel over the toilet and do what people do when they're doing such things, and vomited profusely. So profusely, in fact, that there were sort of violent spasming motions throughout my body as I executed the necessary bodily functions. And I thought very little of this because I was sort of camped out there for half an hour, violently retching up all the remains of vitamin C packets and egg salad and what have you. And it wasn't until I tried to stand up from this half-hour duration that I felt this massive twinge in my lower back, and just sort of stood there half standing and half sitting and being like, no, it's not possible. No, yes, I just threw my back out throwing up. And I was in perhaps the worst pain of my entire life to that point. In the small of my back, just every part of the small of my back feeling like an Orwellian device of torture folding in on itself. And, thought and dealt with that for about 5 minutes and thought I was probably on my way to dying before I had another round of vomiting that didn't make my back feel any better. At this point, the prevailing theory was that the vitamin C packets had something to do with my throwing up, and that I had overdosed on vitamin C. And about this time, my partner Greg knocked on my door and was all chipper and gung-ho for day 3 of the competition. We were doing pretty well at that point. And he said, "Hey, you ready to go? It's time to get going. This is exciting." And I said, "No. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to compete today." And, this is a dialogue being had through the door of this place. And he said, "What do you mean you're not going to be? What are you talking about?" And I go, "Yeah." And he says, "Storey, are you there? Are you okay?" And I go, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, you better be ready to compete." And I said, "Greg, I threw my back out." And he says, "What do you mean you threw your back out?" And I go, "Yeah." So this sort of tragically comedic scenario played out for a while through the dorm room door. And then eventually I sort of staggered over to it and opened it up. And he's like, "Wow, you look terrible." And I'm like, "Yeah, think about how I feel. I threw my back out throwing up." And he said, "Nobody does that." And I said, "I just did." And he said, "Well, what's wrong with you? Is it all the vitamin C?" And I said, "I think so." And pretty unfortunate situation. So Greg somehow, I don't know how, I can't really relate all of the details of it. Maybe there was some sort of implicit coercion. I don't know how. Probably just appealing to my better judgment or my desire not to let him down. Convinces me that rather than going to bed and, dying, I need to get up and dress myself for debate and go to the tournament and compete while I am basically unable to do anything other than think about throwing up and how much pain my back is in. So he convinces me to do this against my better judgment, and I sort of shuffle. I'm walking over, hunched over like some crazy old man, not really able to move, shuffling down the hallway, shuffling toward the buses that they're loading us onto. And we get on the buses, and the buses are about to leave, and we're about the last people on the buses, and there are no seats anywhere in the bus. And so, against all odds and human possibility, I actually have to stand up on the bus. And stand up and try to hold, and the bus drivers are crazy enough as it is. There's ice all over the roadways. I'm trying to hold on to the pole above me with my crooked back and the desire to projectile vomit all over the people who won't give up their seats. It's a bad, bad scene. So we're dealing with this, and it was about 20 minutes into this crazy bus ride that I realized that I was going to die in Scotland. And it was just sort of a matter-of-fact realization. It was like, yeah, I feel like I'm dying, in that sort of euphemistic way that people say, but it's like, no, I'm going to die on this bus, possibly. And if not, then shortly thereafter. So about 2 minutes after I reached that conclusion, in a very emotional moment in my life, the song Stuck in a Moment That You Can't Get Out Of by U2, which is a very uplifting song, addressed to someone who's suicidal, comes on the radio. And I think it was about the third or fourth time I'd heard it. I had heard it enough before to be familiar with it, but it wasn't big in the States at that time. I think it wasn't a radio song in the States, but it was in the UK. And that moment, I don't know if I realized, but I got the feeling that I might actually find a way to live through this. So we get to the tournament, and there is a bulletin out that 60 or 80 people competing at the tournament have all spontaneously contracted the flu overnight. This seems pretty spurious and pretty fishy, and so we do some checking around with the American contingent and try to figure out what the X factor is of the people who have spontaneously contracted flu. Because that's generally not how flus work. That's generally something more akin to food poisoning. And then we start asking which sandwich people had who happened to have been taken out of commission in the course of this. And remarkably, they all had the egg salad sandwich. So it turns out that a rumor starts going around once people are checking who it is, that someone in Scotland may have forgotten to refrigerate the mayonnaise. And at this point, the fact that I'm committing this to film, even many years after, will probably prompt the University of Glasgow Debate Union to try to get this video taken off YouTube. But it's true, and if you were there in 2000, 2001, you remember this. And they had the audacity, I think concerned about the liability and the realization of what a spontaneous flu outbreak looked like, to advise that everyone simply drink some water and eat plenty of salty snacks, which remains to this day perhaps the most insulting thing someone has ever suggested to me. Because when I heard this comment about salty snacks, which to this day remains sort of a running joke among the debate people who were there and myself, I was sitting on a bench, 550-year-old bench. The university was celebrating its 550th anniversary at that time, in the back of this grand, illustrious, drafty hall that they were hosting us all in, while we were waiting because the tournament had been delayed because many people had not been like me and convinced by their partner to suddenly get up and go debate. And I'm sitting, and if I lie down on this bench, then my back feels more or less excruciating than the worst pain I've ever felt. It feels okay. But my stomach is all in a knot and a mess. And if I sit up perfectly straight, then my back is in the most unbearable pain imaginable. But my stomach is stable because things are sort of in the order they ought be. So inevitably, I sort of end up trying to sort of lean at a certain angle where I'm not lying down all the way, and my back is sort of okay, and my stomach is sort of okay. But inevitably, I have very little energy, and I sort of drift, and I'm lying on the bench. And then after about a minute of that, I lean over the side, and heave. Just right there on the floor. That's how little control I had over anything. And then immediately I'm sort of embarrassed and ashamed and try to sit back up and look around and see if anyone's noticed, and people are sort of coalesced into their own groups, and eventually some of the Americans came over to help me when they noticed me in this pattern of sort of slowly then drifting back to an equilibrium and then falling over and heaving over the side. I put a lot of vomit on that floor that morning. We'll continue this story, this scintillating story of how I was almost killed by Scotland, in our next edition of Blue Pyramid Stories. I'm Storey Clayton. Thanks for listening. Good night.